Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Valentine, which I think is my most favorite holiday film, to be brutally honest. And it's like, for me, when watching this film, I'm like, God, why have I waited so long to not go into this film? I think reasonably because there's not a convenient way to watch it. I think reasonably it's a really great movie, but like reasonably just falls on to just being like, okay, well, it's on Amazon right now for like 2.99, or it's on some other apps or whatever for like 3.99, and everything is all like you gotta purchase it or rent it or whatever, or just you would probably rather just buy a copy of this thing for what, probably $5, and probably just own the thing. You'd be better off. And I would honestly suggest it because it's a great film. So, going into this movie, I really do enjoy it. And because I love the whole story of like the Revenge of the Nerd kind of thing, or ultimately having it to where, like, always be nice to everybody kind of thing, because you don't know who is eventually going to be a bajillionaire or be an axe murderer or just reasonably be the person that you hope that they wouldn't, but they would. Uh, and I think reasonably, like, I'm sure that this movie would probably get remade, and then there would be some kind of different, like a way of doing it. There'd be some different hook of sorts, and I think it'll just suffer in that aspect. But I know eventually it's probably going to get remade. I would like to hope at some point, uh, because ultimately I would love to have this thing be a franchise. Mother effers setting up franchises. Yeah, they should, because this was a really good movie. But anyways, so going into here, we ultimately have actresses like Denise Richards, which I've kind of seen her in a plethora of things, scary movies, and all kinds of other like urban legends and like all kinds of horror films and stuff like that. So ultimately, seeing her here, I was just kind of like, yeah, I remember her one being here. I also know she was in Wild Things. Um, but yeah, I really enjoy Denise Richards. Usually she ends up playing the stuck up character, but you know what? Like, I'm sure she's really, really nice. I'm sure she's really, really nice. We have it to her. We have David Boreanaz in here, and I'm probably ill pronouncing that. And so David, of course, we know from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, Bones, and also at one point, for me, honestly, having a credit for him mentioning, or for him ultimately being a voice of Green Lantern at some point. I think in Justice League New Frontier, or ultimately at some point we have it to where I think in one episode of Bones we have it to where David is ultimately holding a comic book of Green Lantern, reading it in the tub or something like that. So ultimately after that, like I was just kind of like, okay, like a lot of these other actors look very familiar, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Ultimately, I've kind of seen every number of these characters at some point, like Katherine Heigl, ultimately from The Ugly Truth and Knocked Up, of course. But anyways, let's go into ultimately um, yeah, I love like the Revenge of the Nerds kind of thing. If anything, like this, uh, in a non-horror realm, kind of reminds me of the movie Just Friends, where in the end we have Ryan Reynolds, who's like really, to be deemed by other people maybe overweight, and eventually when he gets his heart broken by the girl that he's always ever wanted to be with, and we have it to where Amy Smart's character is just telling Ryan Reynolds' character, well, we should just be friends, and then he ultimately rides on his rides away on his bike, ultimately telling all the friends like, "Yeah, I'll show you," and then ultimately he becomes like this. Of course, Ryan Reynolds like with all the 6 pack abs and all that jazz, and he's just like beating women off with sticks and stuff like that, and being also a bajillionaire or whatever, and like I like those kind of movies where you have the nerd that eventually turns out to be like, ooh, wow, like look at him, look at all the things that he accomplished. and that's kind of this movie in a very weird and or horrific kind of way. But anyways, so let's ultimately talk about this movie. We'll tee it up and lead it up for eventually spoilers. So what is this movie about in spoiler terms? So basically we have it to where there's a nerd that ultimately is named Jeremy, and we have it to where ultimately, and I think his last name starts with an M, but I know his name is Jeremy. So we have it to where Jeremy is to ultimately start asking all these girls out. Coincidentally, most of these girls don't actually look like they're older versions of them, but money. And so like the only one that actually looks like the person that they're playing is actually Denise Richards' like younger version. I think that's probably because like she had a daughter or something, which ultimately looked like her. So we have it within this film that reasonably Jeremy is ultimately asking all these girls to dance, and we have it to where they're all kind of, for the most point, blowing them off. To ultimately, Jeremy is to be left with a girl named Dorothy. That it seems that Dorothy is just kind of sitting on this bench, all looking all just like hopeful, romantic, and so on and so forth. And we have to where Jeremy is laying it on thick to just be like, hey, let's hold hands. Like, ultimately, let's just kind of be together, kind of thing. And we have it to where ultimately Dorothy is just throwing herself onto Jeremy viciously, deliciously, weirdly, strangely. And so we end up going on into seeing these people behind these bleachers making out. And all of a sudden, we have these kids that are ultimately going to be pulling a carry on this kid by dumping this juice all over this kid, and ultimately like disclothing him, like kind of making him a laughing stock of this whole school. Ultimately, we find out that Jeremy had a bloody nose, and so ultimately, this kid was horrified and humiliated in front of this school. Because ultimately, we have it to where reasonably, these kids were all saying that, oh, like, he's trying to take advantage of Dorothy. He's trying to attack her. Like, how could he do that? He's a perv. And so ultimately, Dorothy is like, no, but then, but ultimately, considering she's peer pressured by all these guys, she ultimately just says, well, yeah, like, he did attack me. He is a perv. And then I'm like, no, Dorothy, don't do it. But anyway, so he ends up getting humiliated and scarred for life. And then we are supposed to just immediately tell that years later, this kid is ultimately maybe going to quite seek revenge, or maybe there is also some revenge of someone else in this story. Uh, we are led to believe that ultimately it is Jeremy, but you could write this story to be any number of people. Because really, when justifying it, it seems like certain people could have much more of a real legitimate reason for killing any number of people besides it actually being Jeremy, justifiably. So going in here, I thought that there is some kind of like goofy moments in this movie where like I thought they were kind of really kind of funny in some ways, in some aspects. And I know that's just kind of like, because I hate the fact that we have these girls that are ultimately like too good for their own good kind of thing. They ultimately are heckling all these men, and like no man is good enough for them. And recently there are some guys that are ultimately some uh, jerks or garbage guys or whatever, but justifiably when looking at it, I think that these women have too high of a bar as well. And so that's what just blows up in their face, sadly enough. So when going into here, we have some interesting developments, and ultimately, I will talk about that in spoilers. So let's go out of our way to ultimately break down this movie and have this movie fairly interesting. Because at the end of the day, that's all I'm gonna say. Because I thought this movie was like, if you haven't seen this movie, it's great. It's worth a purchase if ultimately you have not ever seen this movie. It's worth buying. Go on and probably find it on some discount somewhere, or something, anywhere. You probably go on Amazon and probably, like I said, probably like buy the thing for like $5. It's a very probably dirt cheap movie that you can probably find for a reasonable price. So yeah, definitely worth a purchase if you can find a good version of it, a variation of it. I mean, like if it's like new or whatever. Definitely buy the thing rather than going and renting it. It's cheap anyways. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie. So in the very beginning of this film, which I had already basically mentioned everything that had gone on. Basically, the entire lead up is what I had just said. The whole beginning of the movie is what ultimately I just said. So we now have it to where all these people are older, and so we kind of have to do the kind of cliche thing that normally single people do. We ultimately have a character who is named Kate, that is the focal character. Is She's like the focus character. She's like the Sydney of this movie, where everybody else is kind of gonna get their time, but like Kate is like the focal point for most of this. So we ultimately have it to where Jeremy had went through when dating, dancing, and so ultimately Jeremy had gone through, and ultimately uh, Jeremy had asked Paige to ultimately dance, and she said no way. We ultimately have Lily, who ultimately Jeremy had asked, and she had ultimately humiliated him. And then Jeremy went to Kate, and she said, well, maybe later, as a pretty much like maybe she was still gonna probably blow him off. She was probably still gonna blow him off. Believe me, she probably was. And then ultimately, Jeremy went to Dorothy, and we know how that went. So Jeremy ultimately asked Dorothy. They ended up lip locking, and hooray for them. But what is to be led after that was just horrific. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably these girls are ultimately going and living their own separate lives. I think Katherine Heigl's character was also at that dance as well, and we had it to where Jeremy asked her out as well, and her younger version of her looks nothing like her, as well as both Lily and Kate, and like Paige is the only one that looked quasi like it. Maybe Dorothy a little bit, but um, most of these girls didn't recognize them. Like, luckily, they had photos next to them to tell, like, oh, this is the younger version of this character. This is the younger version of this character. Otherwise, I would have had no clue. So ultimately, they tried to do it with like yearbook photos, and I think that that was kind of really interesting. So we have it to where ultimately, so we have to where these girls are kind of going their separate ways. We have it to where everybody's getting a Valentine's at one point. And so ultimately, we have it to where Katherine Heigl's character, Shelley, is ultimately going to a dinner with this guy named Jason, which ultimately is, I think, consistently using his, like he's a very much, like, dominant personaed esh like person. If anything, I would really quite much hear him talking about himself in the third person because he's a douchebag like that. We'll ultimately have it to where like the Jason is I'm the Jason the Jason needs a real woman to get him on in the bedroom, and like that's what I was like, kind of just like I was like, God, I hate this Jason character, cause he's like the clicheist like, oh yeah, I'm the greatest gift to womankind in my life, and ba 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 ba. Sure, whatever, Jason. So we have it to where Shelley is ultimately using her fork and putting in her food the word "help me." So we have it to where Jason is ultimately going and eventually getting the check, and we have it to where Jason is like, no dessert? Huh? No nightcap, if you know what I mean? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So we have to where Shelly's like, hell no. So we have it where Jason is getting the check, and ultimately, immediately, Jason is looking at the check, and he's like, well, you ate the lost lobster bisque, and I ate the mushrooms, and I had this, and you had that. They're separating the check, which ultimately I'm like, no, never do that on a date. Never separate the check. It's usually like one person has to pay for it, and like, and I think that that's okay. I think it's goofy to separate the check. I think that's kind of weird. But anyways, so we have it to where Shelly is ultimately just like, God, this guy is the worst date that I've ever had. But on top of that, like, he is the cheapest man alive. So we have it to where ultimately Jason is still like wanting this girl, and Shelly's just like, no, I have finals, I have stuff to study, and I'm bouncing. And we ultimately have it where Jason is just like, the very next woman he sees is like, hey, you wear a nice dress. We ultimately see Jason later on, and I'm like, is he like, you could ultimately, like, I know how this movie ended before it ended, but still, um, like when kind of suspending yourself of misbelief, just ultimately kind of going to here and ultimately just not knowing what the ending is. Like you could ultimately make it to where like there's so many people that ultimately could be the killer, but the only problem is you always have to also go with the whole aspect of like who gets the most screen time kind of thing is how you could approach this movie. So going into this, we have it to where Shelly is on her way to dancing with somebody else in the pale moonlight, and that is a cadaver. Because ultimately, we seem to have Shelly tell us that ultimately she's an up and coming doctor. And so we have it to where Shelly is ultimately getting a little moonlighting with a cadaver, a dead person. And so ultimately, we have it to where Shelly is going to slice and dice open this dead man, and eventually she ends up hearing a noise. She's like, "Oh, is that a kitten?" So we eventually have to where Shelly kind of goes out of her way to ultimately go and see what this sound is, and it's some other student that ultimately is asking Shelly like, "Oh, hey, like you staying a little bit late?" And Shelly's like, "Yeah, I got finals to study for." And ultimately he's like, well, you're not alone, are you? And she's like, no, I have my cadaver with me. So the guy's like, oh, you're weird. And then he leaves. We eventually have it to where Shelly ultimately finds a Valentine's Day card ultimately addressed to her with having some weird, bizarre saying onto it, which I ultimately won't repeat this one here because ultimately it sounded very confusing. But anyways, we eventually have it to where Shelly is ultimately going to slice open her cadaver, and we have it to where this cadaver is eventually going to do this thing called breathe. And ultimately we have it to where Shelly ultimately gets freaked out and runs off. We eventually find the cadaver is in some little hideaway hole, and ultimately it falls out of the hideaway holy closet thing. And so eventually Shelley goes on a good old thrump to try to figure out where to hide from this killer. And so we ultimately have it to where Shelley hides in one of the body bags. and to where the killer is ultimately going and just slicing and dicing through all these bags, just willy nilly, just, I gotta see if she's in these things. I gotta see if she's in here. So we end up finding out to where eventually we have it to where ding, 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 somebody won a grand prize. Because ultimately we find out that Mr. Cupid ultimately opens up one body bag with Shelly in it and ultimately slices her throat and murders her. Murders, kills, deaths, does whatever a normal person would do to a person, when ultimately they would have to be the murderer. And so we have it to where ultimately this girl gets cut, and we have it to where the killer bags up the body bag and then goes about his day. So, as I almost poked my eye, we have it to where ultimately now we are going into finding out what everybody else is doing, what everyone else is up to. It seems that ultimately Kate is ultimately dealing with a guy named Adam Carr who seems to be a alcoholic. And so recently she's gone out of a horrible relationship. It was so horrible. It was the worst she's ever seen in her life. But ultimately, that Adam Carr guy, that David Boreanaz, is ultimately just a guy that Kate just can't shake. So we ultimately have it to where Kate is ultimately going to Paige, and ultimately they are going and speed dating. And it seems the entire time Paige is ultimately hitting on every single man that ultimately Paige likes, and so does Kate. So, but also there's just a ton of times where reasonably we have it to where there's some dates that ultimately are kind of like a spectrum of people. We have some guys that are otherwise just going, and we have to where Kate is like, come on, say something. And then the guy pees a little and runs off. But we have to have a montage and or spectrum of this whole speed dating thing to where it seems that Kate eventually seemingly lands nobody because ultimately Paige is stealing half of her dates anyways. So we eventually have it to where seemingly there is a letter to be delivered to Lily, we are to assume. It's either Lily or it's Paige. I guess it really doesn't matter because either way, I guess both of them are living together. We ultimately find that Lily is ultimately going and getting videotapes of certain fellers, certain guys, and like ultimately, I guess this is the pre thing of like a dating site kind of thing. But ultimately, I guess like yeah, we have people like sending tapes to find love and stuff like that. Where ultimately we find the more that this Lance character talks, the more Lily is ultimately just like click. So we end up having a tour. Lily is ultimately going and going to the door to ultimately getting some Valentine's Day thing, which ultimately is chocolates. We ultimately have it to where Lily is ultimately looking at it and it says JM, and she's ultimately mentioning like to Paige, it's like, well, is it probably you? If anything, you probably went through more of the alphabet than I have. And ultimately, they're trying to figure out who exactly it could be, and they have no freaking clue. So ultimately, we have it to where Lily reads the rhyming poetry-ish thing, and ultimately, like at some point, we have it to where like these poemish like things are really kind of interesting. I think the best one is roses are red, roses are red, violets are blue. They'll need dental records to identify you. I thought that was awful, but again, like I thought it was just kind of funny to ultimately just kind of do this kind of thing. I think reasonably. I think the one about the chocolates were like something about like kind of like you are what you eat kind of thing, and so ultimately, I guess the girls were to assume like, oh, well, that means that we're really sweet. Isn't that nice? Oh, so we have it to where Lily ultimately is going and just, um, yeah, I love the chocolate. And so while she is munching on these chocolates, we have it to where Lily, while eating I'm only eating a piece of this chocolate and not downing the entire thing. And while Lily is ultimately, I'm just eating a portion of this chocolate, we find out that there are these things called maggots in the chocolates. So ultimately, Lily is ultimately just like, this is gross. So yeah, I kind of like that because when honestly looking at it, these girls are so like brutal to men, and I like that ultimately someone is getting back at them for how like crappy they are, like how bad of a person that they are. Someone is finally like ultimately just going like how about you freaking like how about you ultimately get that stick out of your butt and just like be nice to everybody kind of thing, or just kind of just ultimately just go and just be nicer to people, because ultimately these people are just like, I'm just gonna throw away men like tissues. So moving on. So we have it where ultimately Paige and Lily are going through and ultimately just assessing, well, could it be Jason Statham? Could it be Jeremy Murphy? Could it be any person with the initials JM? Ultimately, could it be James or John or Jimmy or uh, Jumbo the Martian? Whoever could it be? And none of the names are really striking to them, with the exclusion of Jeremy. I think it's Milton, or the guy that that otherwise was treating that ultimately they remember bizarrely in school. Because I guess this is the only dorky kid that ultimately asked them out at some point to dance, and so ultimately they knew this kid. So we end up having it to her eventually. Kate, wouldn't it be great, Kate? I think you could be a great mate, Kate. So we have Kate, who is ultimately to go into her house and ultimately try to justifiably take a shower because she has to be at work in a half an hour. And so ultimately her water completely goes bubkiss, and we have it to where Kate is ultimately like having shampoo in her hair, but all of her power went out. She ultimately called her super, and so eventually we have it to where Kate is ultimately dunking her head into a toilet so that way ultimately she can wash her hair out. So we eventually have to where Kate is ultimately going through her house, or going through house, is going through her apartment. She's leaving her apartment to ultimately kind of just repetitiously, continually going by her elevator, and she sees some Cupid mask of sorts. And eventually we have it to where seemingly this guy that is otherwise, I believe, her super, ultimately going, hey, Kate, do you want to date, Kate? We would be so great, Kate. Can't you just be my mate, Kate? I can't wait, Kate. So this guy rhymes this girl's name, and we ultimately, and his name is Barry, because Kate ends up going, "You're really scary, Barry." Or it's Gary. Yeah, it's Gary. It's definitely Gary. You're really scary, Gary. So we end up having it to where ultimately Kate goes about her way and does her thing. So we eventually have it to where reasonably, eventually, Kate is to seemingly bump into Adam Carr, which of course is David's character. And reasonably, at some point, Kate has to reminisce about the time that her and Gary had met. And we have it to where Adam is ultimately saying, "Oh yeah, the guy that ultimately is saying that ultimately rhymes your name and stuff like that. It'd be great, Kate. Let's date Kate." And Kate is just like, God. So ultimately, it seems that Adam has been making progress trying to be clean and sober. He is ultimately 3 whole weeks worth of the sober. And so ultimately, we have it to where Adam is trying to win Kate over by one, sending her a sugary treat when ultimately Valentine's Day is to come up. And ultimately we have it to where Adam is trying to win her over. Kate is ultimately just like, well, maybe he could be like, maybe he could like, I could just like with like he's starting to give me so many brownie points that maybe I'll just end up in bed with him or something like that. Maybe I'll just end up in I'll just end up with him as long as he like clean consistently is clean. So we ultimately have it to where it ends up that these girls end up going to a art gallery of sorts. Ultimately, Lily has seemingly a odd boyfriend that is ultimately played by Max Ramey. Uh, I guess maybe to be remembering, maybe there's a guy named Sam Raimi at some point. Um, but anyways, we have ultimately Lily dating this guy that otherwise is to just get her there. Um, to kind of make out with her and then ultimately have some third girl just watch in the wings. And ultimately, we have it to where Lily is ultimately just like, why is she looking at us? And ultimately, Max is like, oh, come on, just let her look. It's fine. And ultimately, Lily's like, no, like, I'm not going to have this girl looking at us doing our thing together. So we eventually have this bizarrish art gallery that ultimately looks supposedly like some perfume ad or something. And so ultimately these girls have to go certain sections of this. And so ultimately we have it to where they're going through the ringer. And so we have it to where Lily is to ultimately kind of try to get rid of her boyfriend, and ultimately, in the end, someone is going to try to get rid of her. We ultimately have a very interesting scene where we have it to where the Cupid character, ultimately with bow in hand, is ultimately going to repetitiously shoot Lily repetitiously in the stomach of sorts, to where eventually she is to fall down these flights of stairs. Not in the normal way. She's ending up like falling over this barrier and then she's just falling. She's not like down flight of stairs, which ultimately will get there at some point, and I ultimately will enjoy it. So we have it where the ultimately falls Batman Begins style down a thing of stairs to ultimately fall into a dumpster, and now she's dead. So ultimately to have us led to believe that ultimately Lily had gone to LA or some other place of sorts. So we ultimately have it to where eventually all these gals are ultimately thinking, you know what? Maybe we should go to the police because somebody is sending us creepy Valentine's Day things. And ultimately, they also had found out that ultimately Shelley had died and they went to her funeral. And a lot of people are assuming that it's murder. And so reasonably, they have it to where like there could be a suspicion of someone somewhere doing something. We ultimately have the detective Vaughn, who ultimately is making the consensus that it could probably be the Jeremy Milton character that ultimately is trying to seek his revenge years upon years later. Because when looking at it, like, I bet the guy now is a bajillionaire and is ultimately just going to go and just plot his revenge now. Because ultimately, stuff like that will just burrow into your head forever. And ultimately, you'll just never be able to get any supermodel or anything. You'll just be sad and alone. Sad and alone. So, moving on. So, we ultimately have Detective Leon Vaughn, What did they have to? Where did they have to scrape the name of that one from? Just a rhyming dictionary? What rhymes with Vaughn? Leon? All right, sweet. So this detective is ultimately questioning all these girls, and we eventually have it to where Dorothy is to seemingly have a guy called Campbell Morris, who we'll talk about here shortly, and so reasonably we have it to where the detectives ultimately questioning if there's any guys that these girls are to know, and ultimately we have it to where Kate knows Adam Carr, and that's about it. And eventually we find out that Adam is eventually going to get questioned by some detective later on. So we ultimately have it to where the detective is consistently looking at Paige's character and ultimately going like once over, it's like, mm-hmm. And so eventually, when all the other girls leave, we have it where the detective has to pull Paige aside and ultimately, like, you know what? I think you and me have something special going on, and I need to take care of it right here and now. And and this detective is kind of laying it on thick with Paige, and Paige is ultimately just go f yourself, like do your job, and really. So we have it to where Paige is ultimately going off, and so we have it to where reasonably Dorothy is to land herself a man ultimately called Campbell, or I'm just going to call him Morris because I think I can easily pronounce that better. So we end up having this character that is going to go into Dorothy's life, and ultimately it seems that this guy is going to try to get the better of Dorothy, trying to steal every bit of her money from out from under her when she doesn't realize it, and reasonably having an unsatisfying bedroom business moment because ultimately Daniel Cosgrove Cosgrove is seemingly an actually a character in consistent movies where he leaves women completely unpleased by their bedroom adventures, and I don't quite understand why. He has also been in the movie Van Wilder, where him and Tara Reid are ultimately getting busy in the bedroom, and he finishes in like 20 seconds, and we have it to where Tara Reid's like, really? But then eventually the same guy ultimately gets with some other girl in the movie, and ultimately he lasts like 25 whole seconds. And the girl is like, that was the best 25 seconds of my whole entire life. It's like, well, good for you. So, anyways, so again, Campbell, bedroom business, problems. Ultimately, he probably couldn't get it up because he wasn't really trying to get it up because ultimately he wasn't going to get it into her because ultimately he's just using her for her do re mi. So we ultimately have it to her reasonably. Uh, they are seemingly exchanging Valentine's Day gifts, and eventually Dorothy is trying to win him over by ultimately giving some lollipop business, if you know what I mean. Lolly, if you know what I mean. Just ultimately going in and ultimately just we have it to her Paige and ultimately Kate are ultimately recommending to Dorothy to give him a little vacuum business, if you know what I mean. And because reasonably, Dorothy is trying to think of any way to keep this man um, because he's good looking. And what other man, I guess, is she going to end up finding? Because ultimately, like, she ultimately knows full well, because ultimately she tells Kate, like, exactly why. Um, she has, I think, had so many problems finding men, which ultimately I'm baffled and confused about. But it is to be what it is. So I'll get to that later. So we ultimately have it to where Morris is ultimately telling Dorothy that he's going to work out before he starts his shift at his job, but instead, really, he's kind of stealing every little bit of information of Dorothy to get every little chunk of money that he can possibly get out of her. We also have seemingly Ruthie Walker or Hetty Burris that ultimately is going to come into the fray into this mansion and ultimately tell Dorothy that this guy is swindling her out of her money and watch out for him because she had done the same thing to Ruthie. We also seemingly have Dorothy, who is dealing with a much younger stepmother, and ultimately it seems that since this stepmother is giving it to her father, we have it to where her father is taking the side of the stepmother instead of Dorothy. So, moving on. So, we eventually have it to where I think Dorothy has all the reasons in the world to just start killing and murdering all of these people. Like, reasonably, when looking at it, like, especially at the party, it's all really justified, really, for Dorothy, and it all really comes to a head, let's just say. If somebody wasn't getting ahead in this movie, ultimately, it is to be Dorothy. That was an awful joke, but ultimately, let's go on. So, we have it to where ultimately Adam Carr is ultimately working on seemingly doing well with Kate, and ultimately Kate is smitten with Adam. So it seems that eventually they are going to this Valentine's Day party. And so ultimately, here's where we're going to start seeing eventually where the bodies are going to start piling up. We ultimately have it to where Dorothy is going to send Morrison on a journey uh, to light this furnace, and ultimately, while Morris is lighting this furnace, he's ultimately going to get something lit up into his back, which is ultimately an axe. We ultimately have it to where eventually uh, he's left into the sauna, and we'll find out that eventually. So cue us going into this delicious party. So we ultimately have it to where Kate is ultimately hearing that Adam had gotten questioned by these authorities. Now he's having a tough time, and Kate has to kind of comfort him. Ultimately, it seems that reasonably, when Adam gives her a lollipop of sorts, we have it to where Kate is going to give him a note that says I owe you TLC, tender loving care. And so ultimately, when looking at that note, I'm like, you know what? This could kind of tell us who the killer is, but when looking at it, we'll get there. So now we have to push on to this Valentine's Day party. So we have this party, it's kicking off, and so ultimately we have it to where Paige is to seemingly end up with a douchebaggery guy that ultimately was at that speed dating thing. And eventually we have it to where reasonably Paige is to go off into this party and eventually tie a man up on a bed because ultimately we have it to where Paige is like, oh, are you gonna give me something? And we have it to where this guy's greatest gift, I guess, to this girl is his Johnson. And so recently she's like, that's it? Like that's all you're gonna do for me? And this guy is just like, well, like yeah, that's all I'm gonna do. This is amazing. And ultimately and like and aren't you gonna like go and uh do something with it? It's not gonna wax itself. And so ultimately we have to her page is like, uh-huh, I'll wax it for you. So she ends up tying him up and then ultimately pouring candle wax all over his bate because ultimately he had said the wrong magic words, which ultimately is wax. And so she's going to wax him off, wax him on kind of thing, and ultimately just hurt his beshackle. And ultimately she walks off. Ultimately to be leading her into going into the jacuzzi to ultimately just wear a bathing suit. So, moving on. So, ultimately, we have Kate at this party, and it seems that her and Adam are seemingly going well to the point to where Kate is ultimately saying, like, yeah, I think me and you are going to have some alone time tonight. Because ultimately Kate is kind of playing around with Adam, ultimately kind of mentioning that she's gonna end up shacking up with some man tonight, and Adam's like, "Oh, well, who could that be?" And she's like, "Oh, well, I'm young and I'm and I'm ready for some action," and so like just a little play on words. So we have it to where eventually we find Kate eventually going and talking to Dorothy. And so Dorothy ends up telling us that reasonably, uh, she is, she has always been kind of the ugly duckling of this group that ultimately she had been in, and ultimately because she had always been fat, that had meant that she hadn't been getting as many guys as all the other girls and everything like that. And like I feel so sorry for Dorothy, but then again, she's also the person that also blew the whistle on Jeremy. So when looking at it, like I feel horrible for Dorothy in a lot of ways, but when looking at it, she still also basically humiliated Jeremy. And if there is one person to ultimately understand like humiliation, it should be Dorothy, I guess. But ultimately, I guess like no, I just went into peer pressure, and it worked out. So we have it where Dorothy's ultimately mentioning about her past and everything like that, and you're to feel really sad for her. And I really like I enjoy this moment because ultimately we have it to where Dorothy's really like coming to the head of how like a lot of the times she just has to be okay with a lot of things, and I think she's probably swallowed a lot of anger over time with everything that she has just had to be fine about. And so like I really enjoy Dorothy's character, if anybody else, because ultimately it's just like, oh, okay, well, I can understand this character much more so than anyone else. So going into here, we have it to where Kate is to eventually go and find Adam again, and Adam is slugging on the booze. Remind you that he had spent 3 whole weeks just clean and sober, but now as soon as there is a party, he's ultimately just slugging on the booze, and Kate is like, well, like, well, I guess you got right back onto the wagon, and Adam's like, what? Like, it's a party, like, come on, like, I've been good. And Kate's like, well, yeah, but you haven't been that good, kind of thing. So now we go into showcasing Ruthie, which again is the girl that is ultimately going to uh, try and go and steal any little thing that Morris has. Ultimately, we have it to Ruthie stealing Morris's watch that ultimately Dorothy had given him, and so while Ruthie is walking around in this house, we eventually have the Cupid character that ultimately had killed the maid and is next going for Ruthie because she had saw someone get killed. So eventually we have it to where Ruthie is hiding into the sauna at some point, running away from this thing. And we eventually have it to where Ruthie ends up going and finding Morris into the sauna dead. And we have it to where eventually Ruthie is making her way out of the sauna to head out. To where eventually we end up having it to where Cupid ends up going and taking Ruthie and pushing her down into some broken glass to ultimately slice her neck. So, moving on. So, we ultimately have it to our page is ultimately in her jacuzzi, ultimately having a great and wonderful time. And so we have it to her ultimately Paige is seeing a rose and champagne, and she is going on to ultimately just have a nice little pool party, I guess, by herself. And we have it to where it seems like she hears a noise because ultimately someone had opened the door and closed it. To ultimately Paige is like, hey, is somebody in here? Could anybody be in here? Well, I'm just going to go back into swim because I just am just so bored. We eventually have it where eventually Cupid is to end up attacking Paige, throwing her into the jacuzzi, and ultimately putting a seemingly glass, uh, uh, what would it be called? A glass cover over seemingly this jacuzzi. And we have it to where Cupid is drilling holes into said jacuzzi. He is ultimately just repetitiously like, hey, I'm going to give you some air holes. I'm going to be your friend and give you some air holes. And we have it to where eventually those air holes, one of the screw things end up going into Paige's shoulder where she's like, ah. And we have it to where eventually, once Paige is in agony, we end up having it to where Cupid opens the glass opening back up and throws the corded drill into the jacuzzi, which ultimately electrifies Paige and knocks out all the power. So now we only have Kate and Dorothy left. Everyone else is horrifically dead. And so we end up having it to where Adam and Kate are ultimately seemingly playing a journey of hide and go seek. Because ultimately we have it to where Kate is ultimately going like, oh my god, the power is out. I'm a little scared. And so ultimately we have it to where Kate ends up trying to call the detective, and eventually, like per every single movie, we eventually have to have it to where Kate is eventually going to end up walking into every portion of this place and find every single person dead within this home. And I think that is always stupid because you got to do that with every single horror movie. Like we got to confirm every one of these characters are all dead, and we also have to take the time to kill every one of them and showcase how they are all dead somewhere. And I thought that is the stupidest thing in a horror movie, and I don't think it makes sense to do that anymore. Like, I get it, confirm the person's death, but when looking at it, I just think it's all hilarious when you have to have the girl walking into seemingly every portion of part of house, and she's ultimately like, oh my god, oh my friend, oh this person. And so eventually we have Kate giving a little hello to the detective, trying to give him a little ding-a-ling, and ultimately he ends up answering, and ultimately he seems to be on his way. And we ultimately have it to where Kate calls him again to, in the end, find out that he is ultimately seemingly dead in a pond, with ultimately the note that says IOP, which I'm ultimately just like, wait a minute, so shouldn't Adam be accused of the murderer? But anyways, so we have it to where, and ultimately there's a kind of a way to write around that, because when looking at it, you could probably just say it's like, well, Adam had given the detective that note earlier, and hence why he had it on him, and so on and so forth. Because ultimately we find the detective's head chopped off from his bate in this pond of sorts. So we ultimately have it to where, since Kate had saw the note of IOUTLC next to the detective's dead body, immediately when she goes in the home, she's immediately thinking, Adam, you're the killer. So, because there's only Dorothy and you and me and maybe 700 or 800 other people that could quite possibly be the killer. And I hope that it could probably be one of my best friends, or maybe someone in the end that I know. So, anyways, going into this, so we ultimately have Adam, who is ultimately going in, and we have it to where Kate is ultimately saying, "It's you," and Adam's like, "It's me." You're here. I'm here. How could you have done this? Uh, yeah, how could I have just done all this? You know, I'm here. It's great. Everything's great, kind of thing. And so Adam is ultimately getting closer and closer to Kate, ultimately asking, like, Kate, can we just have a dance? Could we ultimately just have a moment? And ultimately, like, Kate is like, no, I don't want to dance. And ultimately, Adam's like, don't make me beg. And so Kate ultimately is into the arms of Adam, and seemingly ultimately, if this is quite possibly Jeremy, like he's finally going to get the dance that he has wanted for years, and ultimately he is to get it. So we end up having Adam weirdly telling Kate, he's like, "We could be great, Kate. You could be my mate, Kate." No, he's ultimately telling her um, that he's always loved her, and ultimately he doesn't care about anyone else. Anyone else could all just die, hilariously enough. And so we end up having Kate being very uncomfortable with his whole dancing thing. And so ultimately, we eventually have it to where Kate is ultimately trying to get as far away from Adam as possible, throwing a champagne at his head and all kinds of things. Hopefully, he is the killer, because man, is she just doing some real damage to a good possible friend of hers. So we end up having it to where eventually Kate runs into the gun cabinet, because everyone has one of those, especially rich people. And so Kate ends up, and I guess luckily it's not locked this time, and ultimately no one ends up breaking the glass, because ultimately that's what usually happens. Is like, oh, the gun cabinet's locked, I can't break into it. But eventually we have Kate who breaks into the gun cabinet and gets a thing of a gun, and ultimately goes out of her way to ultimately try to figure out where in the heck is everybody. So we eventually have it to where reasonably Kate is making her way through this house. Again, Adam is all like, "I'm all knocked out because this freaking hurts, and because blood is coming out of the back of my head." So we end up having it to where Kate ultimately is to go and just journey through the house, just to like play another round of hide and go seek. And we eventually have it seemingly where there's a Cupid character that ultimately is to go and try to give Kate a big old hug. So much so, this hug is so viciously tight to where they end up having to fall down a flight of stairs, which I'm like, yeah! Fall down them stairs, get back up, and then fall back down again. Oh, yeah. I love a scene where peoples are falling down flights of stairs. It's the greatest thing, and they don't do it anymore, because I'm sure it effing hurts. But anyways, we have it to where these people take a tumbling down the stairs, and we ultimately end up finding out that Cupid ends up getting back up, and we have to where Adam is like, "No!" And he pow, 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 just keeps firing bullets into Cupid like it's nobody's business. I think he should have clearly just kept firing. He should have brought out another gun and just pow, pow. He should have just really just went in for like 12 shots. He should have went for the head. Like, everybody knows you should go for the head. Ultimately, he should have just like got a machine gun out and just fired away. Like, he should have really lit up this Cupid, but ultimately he didn't, sadly enough. So we end up having it to where Kate is like, "Oh my god, that must be the murderer, because I've seen this killer only a whole zero amounts of time, knowing that it's actually a Cupid killer person. And so I naturally have to assume that whoever is under that mask has to be the killer." And so we end up having it to where Adam slowly but surely ends up taking the mask off of the Cupid, and it ends up being Dorothy. And Kate's like, "Oh my god, how could it be Dorothy?" And justifiably, there's so many rational reasons for it to be Dorothy that it's undeniable. And so ultimately, we have it to where Adam is ultimately comforting Kate, and we have it to where we have it to where Kate is just like, I think just like she's just in utter shock, to the point of when reasonably, while Kate is hugging on to Adam, we have it to where we see a little driblet of blood coming onto Kate, and then we finally see Adam ultimately having a bloody nose. Here's the thing. So ultimately, one, I think Dorothy in this movie somewhere should have had a bloody nose and could have maybe said that at some point she could have them consistently. Because when looking at it, the Cupid character is supposed to have a bloody nose. And, like, but the whole bloody nose thing wasn't done, I think, well enough for us to really determine the killer has a bloody nose. But it is what it is. But here's the thing. When looking at this, could probably people at some points watch this movie and buy the fact that Dorothy is or was the actual killer, and Adam was actually as Jeremy coming in there to save Kate this entire time from Dorothy? Wouldn't that be an interesting just story? Or how is it that Dorothy had ended up going and knowing full well not had taken off this mask beforehand? Like, so was Dorothy just knocked out bizarrely? And like, I'm kind of wondering or curious how exactly that Dorothy did not decide to otherwise put this mask on, or ultimately she could have ran away from Kate. Any number of things could have like how could this movie have ended this way, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, Dorothy could have yelled that it's like, Kate, it's not me, and then that could have solved everything. But again, I guess we'll never know. But anyway, I don't know. I could really buy both stories that ultimately Jeremy was the one the entire time to try to protect Kate, and Dorothy could have killed all these people. Or we could have had it to where Jeremy ultimately was trying to have a culprit be anybody but him, and he has been orchestrating this masterful crafted plan that had just so well worked out, and so on and so forth, and had got him clean and clear into all of this whole thing. Because reasonably, no one would suspect a dead person. Like, dead people can't talk. And ultimately, there might be some kind of eventual paper trail that ultimately leads Dorothy into very much going after all of these people anyways. And plus, ultimately, Dorothy ending up having this speech to Kate does kind of give her all the motive that they need. And so on and so forth, to have an open and shut case for all of this. Like, when really also looking at it, like, Dorothy would have the money to send all this stuff because she's rich anyways. And maybe eventually there is some credit card trail that ultimately will lead Dorothy ending up buying all of this stuff at some point. But anyways, I really enjoy this movie for its ending, because when looking at it, you can suspect it could have been Dorothy the whole entire time, or you could have went the Jeremy route and just be like, oh man, what a, like, bravo. Well played, sir, to ultimately have another protege ultimately going and ending up falling on the sword after all of this. Because normally we don't get those kinds of movies where reasonably it ends up being that somebody is like giving somebody a scapegoat at the end of all this. And I think that's what I love the most about it, is that there's a scapegoat to ultimately just, oh yeah, just tie all this onto Dorothy. That'll work. So, reasonably, yeah, I enjoyed this movie. I really thought that it was really fun. And I ultimately liked this one as a holiday movie more so than anything else. Ultimately, I'm not actually doing it on the actual holiday. I know a lot of people would ultimately just said, you should have shaved this for February 14th or whatever. Like, when looking at it, it's going to take a while for anybody to really be interested in this movie. So it'll probably take a while for anybody to remember this movie or whatever. But Anyways, I have a lot of other stuff kind of in my back pocket kind of thing. Some other movies that ultimately I've talked about at some point. But anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.